And now this is actually coming back to, I want to say this was Ty who went and brought this up, but I want to talk about 3 types of gaps. And really the 3 types of gaps that really prevent people from going and from making some of these career transitions. And don't worry, for the activity we're going to do right after this, it's going to be talking about how do we actually address those gaps and do some of that action planning. But first, we got to break up the 3 types of gaps. So let's say that you're Alex, right? And you are a technical project manager, or you're a project manager, you're a project manager, and you want to go to the next level of your career. You want to become a senior project manager, right? Well, in that scenario, there might be certain knowledge areas that you don't know about. Maybe you don't know enough about finances. Maybe you don't know enough about organizational structures. You don't know enough about P&Ls. You don't know enough about certain buckets of knowledge. You don't know enough about the system that you're working within, right? You have this knowledge gap that you need to figure out how to close. There might also be a skill gap, right? So oftentimes folks who are maybe transitioning over from one industry into the software development or the UI UX world, they might have a specific skill gap, right? You don't know how to code in a certain language. You don't know how to do very specific types of design thinking. You are unfamiliar with very specific tools and softwares like a Power BI or a SQL or a VBA, these very, very specific skills gaps that people have. And then finally, you kind of have this sort of mindset gap. This is where we commonly see where folks are maybe going from, let's say, the corporate America sector over into the public sector in like government or education, or going from, let's say, the nonprofit world and kind of coming over into the small business or the entrepreneurial world, or small business and entrepreneurial over into the nonprofit. Here, there might be a mindset gap in terms of how you go and how you think about that particular role, or how you think about the particular industry you're transitioning into. My favorite sort of example with this is there's oftentimes many folks within corporate America who say, one day I'm going to make a whole bunch of money, and then I'm going to start a foundation, or I'm going to start a nonprofit, and it's going to be so great because I'll have all this money, and then good things will happen. And when you, let's say, go from a corporate environment where you're maybe used to being in an asset-rich environment, you're used to having tens of thousands or billions of dollars to kind of play with, if you will. And then all of a sudden you transition to a nonprofit environment, which tends to be a little bit more known for how can we impact 1,000 people with a $10 budget, right? How can we go and sort of scramble and be really, really creative and work in more of a scarcity mentality to go and have this really amazing social impact? So sometimes that mindset gap can be really, really frustrating when we're trying to transition to completely different industries that have very different approaches to how they solve problems, whether financial problems or social impact problems. And then arguably, some people like to go in and say, and Ty, this goes right back to your point. Some people might go and say, well, hey, I've got the knowledge. I've gone to certain things like boot camps, and I've got the skills. I've got the mindset maybe of a designer. And now I just need a very specific type of experience to help go into close a gap, right? I need an internship. I need to do a UI UX experience for a small business. I need to do something to sort of round out my portfolio. I want to go and just sort of help you all bring a lot of this together, because we talked, broadly speaking, about this idea of technical considerations, right? What do you want to learn, or can you learn the work? Can you do the work? We talked about those business considerations. We talked about those different cultural considerations. But what you would then go and do, and what we would go and do, especially, and what one of the main takeaways that we're going to give for you all, for you to go and do sort of by yourselves or sort of after this session, is, let's say you've gone and you've already decided, okay, I really want to go and Ty, we'll just use you as an example since you've been so open and willing to share. Now, I want to get that junior level UI UX designer position. for this specific position, what are some of the different technical considerations that you need to have, right? So think the language and the software skills. Think of the certifications are for certain, like, US based positions. Having a certain like right to work, for example. What subject matter expertise? Do you need to know about the Gestalt principles of space and spatial understanding? Do you need to have certain types of previous technical experiences? That kind of stuff. But then I also want you to really go into consider these other two buckets, which people tend to sort of put on the back burner. Are you trying to look at that very traditional 9-to-5 work? Are you looking for something that's a little bit more, not quite gig-like or gig economy-like, but is it more of a project-based role where your workload, when you have a lot of projects, you're working really hard, and when you have a few projects, you have time to learn? I want you to also think about this question, which, again, very, very few people maybe go and touch on, and I wish more people would. But in almost any job, you are a manager of something, a manager of people, a manager of products, a manager of programs, a manager of services, a manager of data, a manager of designs, right? You're some type of manager. And I want you to take some time and consider, when you're looking at your job and the role that you want or the career that you want, what type of manager do you want to be? As a quick example, I run a small business, and what I have very quickly learned is I much more enjoy managing our projects and managing our people in that case than I do managing data or managing our services or managing some of the relationships externally. I don't really get excited about that. But I love working with our internal team. I love helping them grow in their careers. I love helping them stay organized and manage their own projects. And I'm on Asana like 24/7, helping them really think about how to conceptualize their work. So even though my title might be owner, CEO, founder, whatever, how I approach that is as a project manager, and that's how I can go and succeed. And then finally, over in these sort of cultural considerations, again, almost every industry needs UI UX designers, right? You could design the packages for cigarettes, for example, using the exact same skill set of how you might go and design the restrooms over at Disney World, right? These are all things that require that kind of UI UX mindset, that empathy, that sort of design thinking model. But you have to really think about for yourself, do you want a very collaborative work environment where you're always kind of going back and forth and you're getting stuff from your marketing team and you're getting inputs from a financial team and you're kind of doing lots of iterations? Or do you want something that's maybe more of like, hey, Ty, here's your project, here's your work, take this, get it done by this time? You also have to think about in the spectrum, do you want like a very tactical job, a very strategic job, or a very operational job? So in the UI UX context, a very operational job, right? Something you're kind of doing over and over. That might be if you just had like logos and you're just sort of pumping out logos and pumping out icons, right? Not a lot of creativity there necessarily. It's just like, hey, we have these 20 icons. We want you to expand this to 100 and give it to us in 100 different colors. More strategic job within the UI UX world, or a career as a UI UX designer, might be to go and say, hey, we have this brand identity, and I'll use Disney as an example. How can we take this identity of telling stories through cartoons and connecting individuals and families and implement this not just in our animations, not just in our movie theaters or in our customer merchandise, but how do we implement this in our spaces? How do our bathrooms, our hotels, our restaurants, our buying experience, our cruises, how does all of that still go and breathe the essence of Disney, right? That's a more strategic question. And then a tactical question might be something that's kind of in the middle, right? It might be, hey, let's go and develop this new part of our brand identity, and let's figure out how to implement this in one or two specific areas. So you commonly see that, let's say, again, using the example of Disney, if there's going to be a Disney Ireland, well, now you've got to take something from Disney Shanghai or Disney Paris or Disney World or Disneyland, and figure out how are we going to take some of these core design elements and plot them over in a different place, right? So slightly less strategic, but definitely a lot more creativity than that very tactical or than that very operational element. The reason we ask people to consider these things is because if you don't consider them, you might end up going for a very specific title and not for a specific career. You might end up with the title of UI UX designer, but really you're just pumping out logos and that's not inspiring you. And then finally, I'll just go and kind of mention here the dynamics within the industry. When we come to job searching and career searching, again, a title like UI UX designer, project manager, nonprofit leader, a lot of the stress that's going to come with that, part of that's going to be based off of the industry, right? If you have been working in the pandemic, working with homeless services, this has been a very, very dynamic time for you, right? Or homeless services, or let's say food banks who have had, double or triple the amount of traffic, right? They've been hiring new staff, training new people, dealing with new clients. Versus if you've worked at, let's say, organizations like the YMCA, that's been very, very different, right? Because your bread and butter has been these kind of in-person events focused around sports and community. And now you don't have in-person and you haven't had it for over a year, right? So certain industries or certain types of parts of industries have been very, very dynamic during the pandemic, and certain parts have been very, very stable. Technology overall has been a very, very stable industry versus elements in the nonprofit field and even the governmental field have been much, much more dynamic. So these are the things that we don't necessarily force people to go and to have to think about, right? These aren't necessarily requirements. They're not check boxes that you must ask yourself a question in all of these different dimensions. But they are things that we believe that if you consider them when you're thinking about your job search, and when you ask yourself these questions first, that really helps you go into those interviews to ask better questions. It helps you go and to do your research ahead of time. It helps you go and to be able to say, all right, what are some, based off of these considerations, what are some of the things that I definitely already have maybe within my current job? So for example, you might go and say that you already have a lot of the technical things tied to go and be a UI UX designer. You've got the understanding of the conceptual principles. You know the softwares, you know the different brandings. And that can be really helpful for you, so you can go and maybe figure out, okay, what are some of the different actual strengths that you have there? But then you might also go and rightly so say, okay, maybe a gap that you might have might be maybe there's not a formal 4-year degree, right? Might go and have in there might be a formal 4-year degree. And the reason why we want to go and spend a lot of time understanding what are the different proficiencies and superpowers you're bringing to the table and what are the different gaps you're bringing to the table is because once you go and you have those gaps, right, you're able to figure out, okay, yes, I have this gap and it's a knowledge gap. Yes, I have this gap and it's a skill gap. Yes, I have this gap and it's a mindset gap. That lets you go and use your network as well as use some of those interviews that you are going to get. And you can ask them, you can put the question back to your interviewers or put your question back to folks that you're doing informational interviews with and say, how can you help me close this gap? Or how can I use my current skills to close this gap? Maybe having a 4-year degree might be something that's listed on a job requisition. Well, you might go and say, okay, I don't have a 4-year degree in this, but I have a 4-year degree in something else, which gives me context. Both the slides, the resources, as well as that worksheet that we went and we shared that we encourage you all to take a good 20 or 30 minutes to go through it for yourself. Those will actually be shared with all of you and all the participants we have. Most of it's actually online at our website at chocolatemilkdiplomacy.com. As a lasting point for all of you, because one of the questions that we commonly hear that we didn't necessarily hear today is, of these 5 steps, which one is the most important? And pre-pandemic, I would have gone and said that the most important part was what we went over today, but researching, but understanding the considerations and doing some of that work. But in a pandemic-related environment, I would actually go and argue that sometimes this kind of fifth step, which if I had redone this slide, I might have made it the first step and the last step, because sometimes when we are going into this very, very tense career transition environment, we're thinking of this as like, I have to do all these things right now and I will celebrate at the end. But what I would submit to you all is sometimes coming to workshops like this, making it more of a community effort, and taking some of the pressure off of yourself and having those celebrations at the beginning can actually just be a better way to start. So we hope that this workshop was a little fun. We hope that that you all got a lot out of it. And I can't wait to hear from you all later in terms of how we can help you progress through these steps so we can all celebrate at the end of this. Thank you all so much, and I will talk to you all later.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.